You know, when I first wrote this video script, I actually had a sort of meandering video essay style script down that was essentially me indulging in my favorite topic, linguistics. I studied linguistics in university with the hopes of one day being a speech-language pathologist. Then I became a YouTuber. I actually became so inspired from just getting to sit down and write endlessly about my favorite academic field that I decided, at that moment, I'd make a mod for Crusader Kings 3 that adds in more interactions having to do with language. Language is extremely important to history, as people have fought brutal wars on behalf of their languages all throughout history. Language has also been a source of unity and cooperation for humanity, but all the same, has it been impactful? There's no perfect way to translate the complex realities of human language and all of its subtleties into a video game, but what you can do is try to use these historical precedences as inspiration for a fun game mechanic. This video is not some huge essay about linguistics as much as it was in its first incarnation. I've redone it now just to instead be a mix of mod design document in video form and a little basic introduction to just a handful of sociolinguistic topics. Making mods is something I'm relatively new to. I have one major mod release for Crusader Kings 3, which is the Accumulated Legends mod that I was very proud of, but the time has come for a new project, and the best projects start with a plan, so that's what this video is. I've of course got a design document of my own that is much more detailed and includes stuff about how exactly I plan to pull off some of the results I'm looking for, but this video is intended to be the easily digestible video version for people who are lacking experience in linguistics or CK3 modding, or both really. In terms of visuals, by the way, this is literally just uncut footage of me playing Haston and making Norman and then English culture for no real reason. I may here and there pop up some visuals if it's relevant to what I'm saying. Feel free to put it on in the background without fear of missing anything besides my extremely based Haston plays. I hope you enjoy. To start off, this video will be using real contact linguistics and sociolinguistics as an inspiration and a base for creating interesting game mechanics. That means that sometimes I might stretch reality a bit to represent something in a way which prioritizes fun over realism. This is just one of those unfortunate realities of any art which tries to translate reality, but rest assured, I'll be keeping things based in reality to the best of my ability. So I'm going to pick a few, let's call it 3, new systems I want to create. 3 feels like a good number, and it's small enough that this little project won't become too big for me to handle. I'm going to use a guiding principle that I think is pretty key for Crusader Kings 3, which is that the best reward for achieving something should be access to more options and tools. Consider what the best features for CK3 are, and what the worst are. One of the community's favorite implementations in the game is the culture system, which massively expanded the toolset of the game with new things to do across most cultures. One of the least liked things is the court grandeur system, which is just a gold sink. Not very active content, eh? So, I'm going for a high level of interactivity. I think another thing that Crusader Kings 3 thrives on is interpersonal relationships. When the game does a good job of making characters feel like they matter, then players get more attached to those characters and engage in a more dramatic storytelling. Linguistics is also centered mostly on the usage of language as a tool for 2 or more individuals to communicate, emphasizing that sense of interactivity and personability even more. I've often preached in videos of my own about design that it's important for mechanics to feel impactful. I want a sense of achieving X to lead to Y outcome and for that feeling to be satisfying. In some cases, accomplishing something with no reward except the journey itself is fine, and in the Accumulated Legends mod, sometimes that was the case. But for this mod, I'm more looking to create a toolbox. The more tools CK3 has, the more you can do with it, and I think that CK3 has more of a shortage of tools than a shortage of purposes. That doesn't mean what I'm making won't have any purpose at all, but just that the emphasis will be on how my language systems will interact with already existing game mechanics. Let's talk with a little more detail about that. The first mechanic I want to create is a representation of what are called communities of practice. The best way to explain this concept is through example. If you're watching this video, you are probably a gamer, and you probably can't speak English. Si tu es un francophone, peut-être qu'il y aura une traduction plus tard. Sorry, I don't know what came over me there, but I do feel like eating a croissant now. Weird. I was talking about communities of practice, right? When you play whatever game it is you play as a gamer, do you speak differently than you would depending on the game? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but what I can guarantee is that certain words will mean different things in different games. Development in Europa Universalis 4 and in Crusader Kings 3 are not the same thing, although they are, of course, abstractions of pretty similar concepts. Communities of practice, broadly, are groups of people unified in purpose or activity, but in linguistics we focus particularly on the usage of language in those communities. A solid example of a historical community of practice with great linguistic importance would be Italian traders moving goods to and from the Middle East. Out of that community of practice came the famous pidgin language called Sabir. It would be impossible in this era of history to participate in the community of practice of Mediterranean trade without knowing this language, given it was the bridge between people that spoke dialects of Vulgar Italian, French, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, and many others. I suppose you could also either learn all those languages to cover your bases or hire translators who would cut into your profits. But it would have been the wisest choice, profit-wise, to have every trader learn Sabir, whose entire purpose was just to facilitate trade. Not all communities of practice create new languages or even speak just one language. To be very clear, a community of practice is an extremely broad concept, which has all manner of different conceptions. The Discord call that you waste your early 20s playing League of Legends in is a community of practice all on its own, just like those Mediterranean traders. So we have a historical precedent, which is the community of practice. How do we make it into a mechanic? Mechanics in a game like Crusader Kings 3 are tools to achieve creative outcomes, broadly speaking, so I'm going to work backwards from the purpose of the mechanic, then come up with how it works. Community of practice as a concept is directly connected to identity, access, opportunity, and activity. I want to design some group activities and group decisions which can only be accessed with the appropriate linguistic ability. There's a lot of potential ambition here, with perhaps every language having some kind of activity. There are a lot of languages in Crusader Kings 3 though, and I don't want to complicate things, so let's make some languages overlap. For example, we could make one activity that covers all the steppe languages, and one activity that covers the Germanic languages, but then we run into the problem of oversimplification. It's unlikely that Bavarians would share a community of practice with Scandinavians despite them sharing a language family. I think the best answer to this problem would be to make activities and decisions which are related by culture, and make access to them require at least one of the languages or a culture that engages in that activity. For example, I can make a relatively simple decision that hires 3 Varangian veteran knights, which is only accessible by knowing the Norse language, and having at least one character of a culture with Norse as their language to act as an intermediary. That would be so easy to implement that I've actually already done so. Here it is. Hire Norse veterans. You pay some gold, and you get yourself some randomly generated Varangian veterans. I've even added in a 1% chance for a legendary spawn, which is a Varangian with the Herculean trait, and a minimum of 30 base prowess. A little bit of randomness is always fun, right? So we've got the purpose of the mechanic. Now let's talk about the mechanic itself. As of now, just knowing Norse is enough, but I want to emphasize the community idea here. Instead of needing to know the Norse language, I'm going to add a new decision to the game that adds a trait with XP tracks to it. Let's call this trait Norse Speaker. I think language ability is not a binary switch. We don't live in a world where a person either knows or doesn't know a language. Instead, people have different levels of skill in their languages for different purposes. For example, in real life, I speak English natively, and I speak pretty okay French, but mostly for scholarly or service purposes. I speak really bad Punjabi because it was useful for me when I worked in film with a lot of Punjabi-speaking sets, and I speak Spanish somewhere in the middle. You might call my French upper class, in the sense that I read quite well and know a wide vocabulary, but drop me in Paris and I'll need time to learn the idioms and mannerisms. My Punjabi is the inverse. I know the basics and can hold a basic conversation in work scenarios or among friends, but I certainly couldn't read a book at any level beyond a child's level. For that reason, this new speaker trait will have levels. I'm going to divide language skills into upper class, lower class, and scholarly. These levels in the trait will change the possible outcomes of the unique decisions that language knowledge grants. This brings up the question of how it will relate to the already in-game language system. We're going to make it so that you can obtain these speaker traits by knowing a language. This might sound weird, but consider the language learning scheme to be something like learning the very basics of the language so that you can communicate at the most basic level, allowing you to begin gaining experience as a speaker. Gaining experience is a matter of engaging with speakers of that language, which can happen at random while in activities with the appropriate language speakers. That might include attending a feast or a grand tournament. It might include sway, seduce, and befriend schemes. Now that I know what I want out of this mechanic and what the mechanic is, I'll make a to-do list. I need to create a trait for each language with 3 XP tracks. I might revise how that works because that sounds really cumbersome. I must create a decision which one can take to acquire that trait. I need to create a set of random events, let's say 10 total, which fit into the game's default activities and interactions which grant experience in those tracks. Then I need to create rewards for gaining progress in those tracks in the form of decisions and maybe activities. I'd actually be very curious to hear what you think would be interesting rewards for each language. If the Norse language gets access to some special Varangian knights, then what would a speaker of something like French get? If you think you have a good idea, drop it in the comments and I'll reply to you about what I think of it, and if I may even use it or not. Thanks in advance. That's not too bad. That would be a system of communities of practice with a new progressive mechanic that offers different rewards depending on the language you learn. Awesome. I won't bore you with the actual implementation of the TXT files, since that is something that I'm not so good at explaining. I don't have a ton of modding experience, so I'm not some expert that can easily explain the process, but maybe once the mod is done, I can do a little retrospective on it. That's one of the 3 mechanics I proposed. This one was pretty big, so let's go with something a little smaller here. I want to talk a bit about contact linguistics now. Contact linguistics is the broad study of the interactions between speakers of different languages, referring to the contact of their languages, you might say. It usually looks at people who don't share a mutual language, but can be extended to cover how people who speak different native languages might use a mutual language differently, and given it's such a broad field, I can move in many different directions. Let's talk a little bit about pidgins and creoles. A pidgin is a language which is a mix of 2 or more other languages that intends to serve a particular purpose, which is most often to bridge a gap between speakers without a shared language. Pidgins are, by their very nature, temporary and poorly recorded, but the aforementioned Sabir language is an example of one. A creole is similar to a pidgin, except in one extremely important way, which is that while pidgin is an instrumental language for a particular usage, a creole is a native language that takes traits of 2 or more languages. Pidgins can become creoles once the usage of that pidgin transcends just being a tool and into the actual day-to-day native language of a people. Haitian Creole is probably the most famous of these, with a highly French vocabulary, or lexicon as we call it in linguistics, but more of a West African grammatical base. I'm going to once again work backwards from the intended goal of the mechanic. I want the ability for 2 cultures that have different languages to hybridize their languages into one as a creole mechanic. This wouldn't serve much purpose in the base game, but given our new language mechanics around communities of practice, we can make a creolized language able to participate in both cultural communities maybe, as a way to incentivize the system mechanically. How do we accomplish this? Well, I actually don't need to do anything too advanced to make this work. Like I said, I want to make this a relatively simple system compared to the last one. If the head of 2 cultures, which do not share a language, become friends and have, let's say, at least 80% cultural acceptance, then either side can take a decision to creolize the languages, which would send an event to the other cultural head asking if they agree to it, and if they do, then both cultures begin speaking a new language. This will require me to figure out a way to generate new languages dynamically in the game, and that will probably be the hardest thing to do mod-wise. There's already a system in the game for hybridizing cultures, so maybe I can study that system to find a way to make new languages. I presume it'll be by using lists, which is unfortunately an aspect of CK3 modding I'm relatively unfamiliar with. Oh well, it's a good thing I like learning. The question now is how one might creolize with a culture that has no cultural head, and in that case I'd actually say that it should be up to you, the player, to create either a vassal or independent realm that can actually have a character that acts as the head of the culture. After all, creolization shouldn't be as simple as just having cultural acceptance. To help gatekeep the decision a little bit more, let's also make it require that the initiator has to have maxed out the XP tracks on the speaker trait for that language. This way we can once more tie the mechanic into a previous mechanic. I also want to tack on a much easier system, which would be one of linguistic dominance instead of linguistic mixture. How about the ability to change a culture's language to yours? This is much easier to implement, at least in theory, than a Creole system, but the question is under what circumstances could a culture change its language? I think first off, you should have to control all of the counties of that culture, and there should be no culture head for it. The intention here is to simulate a dominant culture essentially eradicating the prestige of a language by removing its upper classes from power. Think of something like the expansion of Parisian French throughout France, as Occitan or Breton-speaking lords were Francified over time. There's no way to simulate cultural change over time in Crusader Kings 3, so instead we'll take the more direct route of replacing those lords with ones that speak a different language. If you can pull that off and keep it the case for 20 years, then the decision to force a language on a culture can be taken. This is a horrifically gross oversimplification of how language change occurs, but like I said in the introduction, we're going to be gamifying these systems so that they're not cumbersome and focus on fun. Now we just need to compile the tasks into a list. This to-do list is much shorter. We need to create a system that allows for the dynamic creation of new languages, and a decision that allows a ruler to propose the creation of a creole. We'll also need a decision that allows a ruler to force a change in language on a culture. A smaller list for sure, but that dynamic language creation system is intimidating me already. We've got one last mechanic to consider, and since the last one was relatively simple, let's go over something in the middle, complexity-wise. Linguistic prestige is something just about everyone is aware of implicitly, but it's actually a very complex social interaction among even speakers of the same language. Prestige is often seen in this black and white system, where a language is either prestigious or not prestigious, like in the court language system of Crusader Kings 3. The truth is that prestige is entirely context dependent. The sort of standard American accent that you might hear from news anchors on TV might seem respectable and correct, But take that accent to a pub in Boston and you'll get some janitor talking to you about apples. Prestige is entirely based on the perception of the people that hear the dialect, and for that reason, the way a ruler chooses to speak might affect how their subjects, vassals, and particularly other lords might perceive them. Choosing what language to speak and how to speak it is important, but to cut down on bloat, I'm going to create a system that will be similar to the deity system in the base game. You'll have a handful of options, which will include a low-class dialect that will help you get along with your subjects, but alienate courtly vassals, an upper-class dialect that upholds your prestige and reputation, but alienates you from others, a religious language that will get you approval from your religious authorities, but alienate, well, everyone basically, and an option to speak your court language, if it isn't the same as your native language, which will be a way to appear more egalitarian to your subjects of different languages. Think of it like a neutral ground, where you're not forcing your language on them, but instead everyone has to pick up this new language that keeps the field even. I want to tie this system in with the vassal types mechanic, with parochial vassals representing your lower class local dialect preferences, zealous vassals preferring religious language, courtly vassals preferring the upper dialect, and minority vassals preferring the court language. The odd ones out are the glory hounds and minor landholders, but I think it's relatively easy to handwave the glory hounds as just not really caring about the issue, and the minor landowner vassals, which are just mayors by the way, being lumped in with the parochial vassals. Choosing your dialect won't just reflect vassal opinion though, but your wider perception in the world. Speaking lower class dialect should harm your prestige, but maybe reduce men-at-arms upkeep cost, as more soldiers are willing to follow a ruler they feel close to. Upper class dialect should be the opposite, with more prestige but more expectations. Soldiers want more money to work for someone who they see as a higher class person. A ruler who speaks in the language of the religious class should have an easier time interacting with their head of faith, as well as just generally getting more piety. I'll have to define what each religion's liturgical language is, by the way, but it shouldn't be particularly hard. I can use Latin for Catholics, Arabic for Muslims, Greek for Orthodox, and so on. But the thing is that now we have to distinguish between liturgical Greek and vulgar Greek for the Orthodox, as well as Quranic Arabic and vulgar Arabic for Muslims. This isn't so hard though, as I can easily mod in a few languages as needed. Latin is already in the game, but it can only be learned by getting a rare event while attending a university. I'll have to add stuff like Koine Greek and Quranic Arabic, but how can a character learn a language which is not native to any character? I think it's relatively easy to add another new trait to the game with this mechanic, which could have an XP track of its own. It'll be similar to the language speaker trait from the first mechanic, but instead it'll have one XP track, which is just fluency. You gain experience in that track by going to university, going on pilgrimages, or using a decision to hire a tutor that gives you a flat amount of experience for gold. Sometimes a simple solution is best, right? Once the liturgical language trait track is complete, the option to speak that language in your everyday life is available. What I'm considering now is whether to implement community of practice mechanics for these liturgical languages, but I'm thinking maybe not to. I want to keep the scope on this mod limited to something I think I can handle, so we'll skip out on that. When it comes to the court language option, it'll only be available if your native language is not your court language, and access to it is dependent on you learning the language via a scheme. I don't want to tangle this up with the community of practice speaker trait, because then it might force players to feel like they always have to make their community of practice trait be their court language. For the purpose of just conducting courtly matters in the court language, you wouldn't need total mastery, just the basics are good enough. Anyway, nothing in here should be particularly complicated to put in, so let's assemble the to-do list. I'll have to make a decision that allows the player to pick from a lower class, upper class, liturgical, or court dialect, which can just be a permanent character modifier exactly like deities. I'll have to implement a couple new languages for each faith and tie them to those faiths, which I can probably do via a special doctrine on the individual faiths. I'll have to do a little bit of research to even figure out what the liturgical language would be for faiths like Waki or something, but in case I don't want to do that, I can also just pick one of the more common languages in that faith's cultures, like Cushitic, and just make classical Cushitic or something like that. I'll try and do some research though, since that's always fun for a language nerd like me. Finally, I'll have to create a trait with an XP track for liturgical languages and then add in some XP gains from the associated activities and the decisions to hire a tutor. Alright, there are my three mechanics meant to be abstractions of these three linguistic concepts: the community of practice, contact linguistics in a broad sense, and language prestige. I hope I did a good job of clearly outlining the vision for these mechanics, and hopefully I've even got you interested in the mod idea. One last thing I want to add, which is just a sort of cherry on top, is some achievements. I think it's really fun when mods add achievements to the game, and CK3 actually has support for modded achievements, although Steam doesn't, so I can't get you more achievements on Steam, only in CK3 itself. I could go into depth about achievements, but honestly I don't know what to make yet, so I don't know what to write here aside from how to create the achievements. I'd say achievements are best when they require creative play that wouldn't otherwise be a focus of the game, like a true and perfect knight, which, although sometimes annoying to get, makes you pay a lot more attention to your knights. I also like achievements that ask of you something which isn't necessarily hard, but satisfying for the effort put in. For example, Blood Eagle is lots of fun to do, and for newer players can be kind of hard to do quickly. Something like AEIOU and Me is an interesting one because it's a very unique challenge with a very satisfying ending, and I'd really like to make achievements like that if possible, but that might be more complicated than it's worth. We'll have to see how quickly I get this mod done, since yeah, sure, if I have like 3 days left over after making a 1.0 build with all the bugs fixed and stuff, then sure, I could put some effort in. But if I'm scrambling to get everything ready for the DLC's release, then I'd rather put achievements in as a patch later on. That transitions nicely into the timeline, which is always important to any project. In terms of timeline, I'd like to get this done in time for the release of the Roads to Power DLC, which I have early access to. It's coming out on September 24th, so that gives me just under 2 weeks as of the writing of this script to put it together. I'm almost certain that exact mechanics and choices will change over time as the realities of my own abilities as a modder will limit me, but I've got a vision that I'm trying to fulfill here. I will make no promises that it will come out by the time the DLC releases, since I'm quite inexperienced, but that is my goal, and with the release of this video, I'd be curious to see what people think of the idea. You see, I've often been a critic of the overall design philosophy of Paradox games as of late. I've got all kinds of little video essays from the past, and one relatively recently that go into detail about my thoughts on the game. These videos often come across negative, and especially the recent Victoria 3 essay did, if only because my thoughts on the game tend towards the negative. But I'd like to try and criticize with some semblance of, well, positivity, if I can. To me, every critique I throw at a Paradox game is intended to be my attempt at communicating an issue so that someone might listen and try to fix it. When I talk about historicity in Victoria 3, it's because I believe the game has issues that, if solved, would make for a better game across the board. That being said, I also believe in putting my money where my mouth is, and that it's very valuable to understand where developers come from when they make decisions. The worst kind of critique is critique born from ignorance. Think about your overweight uncle explaining to you how the professional hockey player should play the game. I don't actually have an overweight uncle that talks about hockey, now that I think about it, but imagine the archetype, if you will. A lot of critiques towards Paradox games can feel like they're coming from that kind of guy. I don't ever want to be that guy, and that was why I stepped into Crusader Kings 3 modding with my Accumulated Legends mod. You know all those people that complain about repetitive events in CK3? Well, now I understand why they repeat so much, man. Making an event in this game is extremely laborious. You can pump out a bunch of pretty meaningless ones kind of fast, but then that's called event spam. You can also put out a handful of pretty nuanced ones, but then they'll inevitably repeat themselves, and that's boring. I've learned to never complain about event spam or repeating events because, yeah, I get it. One event can sometimes be hundreds of lines of code, maybe even thousands, and the hardest part of my Accumulated Legends mod was making all the events by a long shot. That's the kind of humility I want my critiques to come from. I know this section has kind of veered off from the original topic of, well, this mod and all, but I'm tacking it on because making this mod is, to me, something very important. I care a lot about linguistics, and I want to see a game which represents some of my favorite aspects of linguistics in it. I've learned over time that no game will ever be a truly accurate representation of the complexity of just about any facet of humanity, but goddammit, I want them to try anyway. What I'd like to hear about from you down in the comments is what sort of mechanics pulled you deeper into the game. When I made the Accumulated Legends mod, I focused on the idea of a reward being something active instead of passive, since I had harped on that idea for a long time. I think the best rewards in Paradox games are ones which create new gameplay mechanics, like raiding as a pirate in EU4, or access to new decisions and CBs in CK3. Most of the rewards for completing Legends in my Accumulated mod were centered around new interactions and war goals. They were centered on giving you more to do. I want this mod to do the same, since that other mod was received extremely well by the community. I'm not trying to make a bigger deal out of what is essentially just a video presentation on a mod, but I like to think that every time I put together a mod, it's my attempt at parlay with the CK3 game designers. Not that they'll ever see my mods, they're far too low quality for that, but I really want to avoid that image of the armchair designer. Anyway, I'm just meandering now. I'm going to christen this mod Languages Expanded, and maybe later on incorporate the word GigaChat in there. Let me know some of your ideas for each culture, and stay tuned for the mod release. I'm making the mod for Road to Powers patch, which I have early access to, including the game files, so I'm really hoping that whatever Day 0 or Day 1 patch comes out won't break what I've made, but also none of what I'm making is tied into anything new in the game files, so there shouldn't be any issues. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your time.